related to transmission planning and the changing resource mix. And to lead us off on this discussion today, we've got Zack Hale, who, if any of you follow the industry trade press, you're familiar with Zack and his work. Zack's a reporter for S&P Global. Zack, thank you for agreeing to moderate today's panel. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you and let you do the introduction or have the panelists introduce themselves and start our discussion. And we'll try to leave some time at the end for questions from the audience. So, Zack, up to you.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. Career milestone to be moderating a WIRES panel. And I know it wasn't intentional to have the panel start at the same time as the FERC meeting, but
hasn't started yet.
Okay, so it hasn't started yet, but we do have commissioners spotted in the meeting room, so I think we're getting close. I'm not going to belabor the need to build more electric transmission to this crowd. I think we've all seen the various estimates and projections. There was the DOE study on solar futures, which estimated that the grid is going to need to expand by about 50% by 2050. There was the Princeton analysis that estimated that we're going to need to double our historical rate of transmission capacity, new capacity by 2030 in order to realize the full benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. And we're holding this meeting during extreme heat advisories throughout the country. So yeah, I'm going to turn to my panelists here and just let them introduce themselves, and then we'll dive in.
My name is Ken Seiler. I lead our planning division within PJM.
I'm Pamela Quinlan. You may know me. I was Chief of Staff at FERC under Chairman Rich Glick, and then most recently was there working for current Chairman Phillips on electric energy markets and resource adequacy, and special advising him on those topics. And as of about 2 months ago now, Rich Glick and I decided to launch our own consultancy. So we have a new consultancy called GQ, Glick Quinlan, New Energy Strategies.
Kim Duffley. I'm a commissioner with the North Carolina Utilities Commission. I've been a commissioner since 2019, and prior to that time, I was a senior staff attorney from 2011 to 2019, and prior to that time, I did environmental litigation for the North Carolina Department of Justice.
Great. So just a little bit of stage setting here. I'm going to turn to you, Pamela. Can you just kind of quickly review what has happened recently at FERC on transmission planning and what has not happened, and in your view, what needs to happen going forward?
Great. So as many of you know, when Rich Glick was chair of the commission, there was a series of efforts kicked off related to transmission planning and cost allocation. Two of those were rulemakings that were started, which was initially the transmission planning rule, which sometimes people at FERC call like track one, which you might hear in that framing, which was looking at a very high level, going further ahead 20 years, figuring out ways to skate to where the puck is going to be, and can get into more detail on that. There was also the interconnection proposed rule, which should be, I was hoping to say like breaking news, but the meeting hasn't started yet. So hopefully we're expecting that to be finalized today based upon what's on the Sunshine Notice. There's also efforts that were, as part of the FERC-NARUC Joint Task Force, there was a lot more coordination in the state, bringing the states into the work at FERC. And coming out of those discussions was the interest in the interregional transfer capability and the tech conference there. Also efforts on oversight that were launched. So there was a lot of things that have happened that are still kind of in the queue to continue forward at FERC. So we do expect the final rule to be issued today on interconnection. It's notable, I think, that was finalized first rather than what started first, which was the transmission planning rule, and I think that highlights which one's trickier to get out the door. I think it's also I think the other thing that hasn't happened or been really started yet is a kind of relook at incentives. When you start to think about how the system's going to change how it is being planned, assuming all of these things come to fruition and you have final rules, the incentives framework, which Chairman Chatterjee kind of started off re-looking at, but that never got brought to a final rule, is probably going to need to have another fresh look to line up the incentives with what these efforts are trying to accomplish.
Thanks. And Ken, PJM is obviously a large RTO with a very diverse set of member states. Can you just kind of bring us up to speed on where PJM is at on its transmission planning efforts, and how do those factor into PJM's ability to manage this kind of wave of resource retirements that we're going to see over the next decade?
Sure, it's a good question. A lot of moving parts here right now, right? So we're in the middle of this energy transition, and we see a lot of generation retirements. We see a lot of load being very, very concentrated in certain parts of our system, like Dulles Airport area, where you have Data Center Alley. We see large data center growth in Columbus. So you take decreasing generation, you take increasing levels of load, especially very, very pocketed in certain parts of our system, and it's going to create some issues in the future unless we do something. And I think the way we do something is to build transmission to get the generation to the load centers. And one of the things we've kicked off most recently was a longer-term regional transmission planning process looking 15 years out. We've had a 15-year out process for the last 25 years that we started in the late 90s. We've looked at that as an avenue to build long lead transmission when we had low growth, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5% in some areas. But we haven't seen that kind of low growth in years, right? The other thing that happened was we had the Utica and Marcellus shale gas that moved a lot of the generation much, much closer to the load centers. And in fact, if you look at our footprint, and each one of our footprints are different. John talked about the issues that they had back in the early 2000s with high wind concentrations in the Dakotas, getting that to the load centers. And what they did there, we have a very different system. We have a very tightly integrated system. We've traditionally had a very boring system. So from an engineering viewpoint, it's a very boring system. Short transmission lines, not a lot of low growth recent years. We've had a lot of generation. We've had operating reserves of 28%. And we haven't really had a major need for major transmission. And when we did, we built it. We built Susquehanna-Roseland back in like 2008, 2009 to go from eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey to help New Jersey out a little bit. And we've had generation come on to replace existing generation. But now we're seeing a major transition. And we're going to need transmission for sure in order to accommodate some of the risk that we're seeing. And we're seeing our risk moving from the summer, although today and tomorrow is going to be a little bit risky in all our systems. We're primarily seeing the risk that we have on our systems moving to the winter. So in order for us to mitigate a lot of the risks that we're seeing, we're going to have to build transmission and make sure that we can get those megawatts up onto the bulk transmission system and get it into the major load centers. But we got to be surgical about it. We're not West Texas. We're not going to be able to just plow through 400 or 500 miles of transmission, 500 kV lines across our entire footprint. It's never going to happen. So we got to be surgical. And the other thing is cost conscious. It's difficult to cite it, but it's also very expensive, and who pays for it? So we're trying to be surgical. We got to get out ahead of some of these things. And at the same time, we have a lot of things moving across the system, even like offshore wind coming on board, which is going to be some generation to our east. Right now, we have an ocean there with nothing other than 2 6-megawatt generators off the coast of Virginia Beach. And now we're going to be looking at a major, major transformation there as well. So a lot of changes. Transmission is going to be kind of the glue that's going to bring the generation to the load to make sure that we can get through this transition very, very reliably.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken. And Commissioner Duffley, as a state utility regulator here in North Carolina, how does transmission planning factor into the state's ability to meet the carbon reduction goals under the carbon plan that was enacted in 2021?
Sure. So for those of you that aren't familiar, North Carolina passed a law, it's House Bill 951, and it was a bipartisan measure that requires the Utilities Commission to issue what's called a carbon plan. I always thought it should be called a decarbonization plan, but it's a carbon plan. And it applies to Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. And the goals are 70% reduction in carbon emissions from 2005 levels by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. And so transmission really is a key component for North Carolina to be able to meet these carbon goals. And you can see that if you pull our carbon plan. We were given a very short deadline by the General Assembly. They passed it at the end of 2021, and the Commission had to issue our carbon plan order by December 31st of 2022. So if you go on our website, you can find that plan. But in respecting the state for jurisdictional divide, we did have a section with respect to transmission. And the first thing that North Carolina did is we encouraged the companies to move from a reactive transmission planning process, where they're just reacting based on load and based on interconnection requests, to a proactive transmission planning scheme or facility. And so we approved or said it's reasonable to move forward with Duke being able to build out proactively transmission in what's called the red zone. And the red zone is in the eastern part of our state. That's where a lot of solar, as you all may know. North Carolina used to be number 2 in the country for installed solar. We've probably dropped down to number 4 or 5 at this point because of Texas and Florida. But we have large solar growth in the eastern part of our state where the land is inexpensive, you have flat land, and there's a little bit of the capacity's gone. And so we have allowed, to the tune, I think at the time the evidence was class 5 estimate of $500 million. So that company can move forward with that proactive plan. The other thing that we did in the order, again respecting FERC jurisdictional boundaries, is to encourage Duke Energy to increase the transparency and openness, as well as to allow for more stakeholder input in their local transmission planning process. It's called the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative. We're not, Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress is not in an RTO. So how they comply with Order 890 and Order 1000 is they do their local transmission planning process. They tried to use that same process for Order 1000. FERC said no. So Duke Energy had to join a different region, and they ended up joining the SURTEP region. And so I'm happy to say that Duke has made progress in making revisions, making it more open and making it more transparent. And they're actually looking at multi-value projects and multi-value type planning process as well. And I think they're probably going to file something at FERC. They are also becoming, and we encourage them in the order, to become a leader in the SURTEP regional transmission planning process as well. And I know that Duke Energy is working with Southern Company now and looking at what reforms can happen in the SURTEP process to allow that to be more open and more transparent and allow for stakeholder input with restrictions. I heard a previous speaker talk about we don't want it to turn into the interconnection queue process when you're looking at transmission planning. So those are the things that North Carolina's been doing, and I think they're all very positive developments.
Great. And so I'll pose this next question to Ken first, and then others can chime in here. FERC, it issued its long-range transmission planning and cost allocation proposed rule last April. My understanding is that the Commission is still considering and weighing the hundreds of comments and reply comments that were filed in that proceeding. And meanwhile, we have RTOs and ISOs that are starting to reassess their own planning horizons on more of a proactive basis. How far can kind of the stakeholder-driven reforms within RTOs and ISOs and in areas like CERTEP, how far can those get us as we wait for a final rule on long-range transmission planning, which it sounds like maybe sometime next year?
Yeah, a few things. So I think our stakeholder process is one that is certainly time-consuming. It can take a long time to get something passed, but usually it's fairly robust at the end of the day. And it's good to get input on some of these very complex issues that we're all dealing with here across the industry. So it's good to hear from everybody, get different perspectives, get the input, and then integrate that into whatever a plan is that we're going to proceed with, and then go ahead and file something at FERC. We were very supportive of FERC's ANOPR and NOPR and provided a number of comments. We spent a lot of time on it. We thought we were pretty thoughtful. We reached out to some of our other folks like New England and MISO and California and Texas and talked to them about a number of things as well as part of the IRC that we have as a group of planners that get together every so often. But overall, we were very supportive. We have the long-range transmission workshop that we kicked off last Friday, where we're looking at enhancing our 15-year out process that we have in place today. And that was very successful, got a lot of very good comments. And I think we'll be looking to integrate some sort of new process later this year that will go ahead and then change the manuals, maybe depending upon how far we go with it, make a filing at FERC and try to get out ahead. The benefit of that in terms of getting out ahead of FERC is that then they can see some of the work that's already been done out there, see some of the sentiment from some of our 5 different sectors in our stakeholder process, and then maybe use that to help inform an actual compliance order at some point next year.
Anyone else?
I think when you think about FERC rulemakings, I tend to think of them not that different than I think of like standards, which is kind of like a floor. So usually they come in when there's a concern that folks aren't keeping up enough, and you want to actually set up and say, no, we need you to move forward. Usually by the time they're finalized, from like when they were first kicked off with like a notice of inquiry or an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking to the actual final rule, it doesn't even, some regions already comply with it. Like today, hopefully they're going to finalize, I'm not sure everyone's paying attention to it, but the interconnection final rule, which was going to require to move to the cluster approach, which a lot of regions already do or have changed to start to do that. And I think commissioners, by and large, at FERC would really prefer a lot of these solutions to come from regions because there are some unique challenges there. So I think the idea that like we should sit on our hands and wait for FERC to take action, I think both wastes really critical time and also misunderstands kind of the intention of a FERC rulemaking, which when there are really good things happening in the regions, I can tell you from experience that that the people at FERC, when they think about those rules, they're trying to make sure that it's certainly not doing harm to the good work that's actually happening. Now, whether everyone thinks that actually gets accomplished, I can tell you it's a goal. So I think stakeholder processes, and all the regions have really different ones, I think are really helpful to get input and make sure there's not unintended consequences of actions that are being taken. But I also think that there are things that the RTOs and ISOs can do that don't have to have stakeholder processes that end up with tariff changes, but that use the authorities that they have today. Like what we heard today about what MISO's been doing, right, on transmission planning. And I think the regions can learn from each other about how to really think creatively about the authorities that you have, how to get through potential changes to, with your stakeholders for your manuals and how you approach it, but that the challenges are well understood. FERC rulemakings take a really long time. They have a really important role, but I wouldn't think of them as like the ceiling of what can be accomplished, but the floor of what really needs to be getting done. So I think for at least that would be my framework of thinking about these rules, and I would hope that the RTOs and ISOs and the different planning regions are really trying to get ahead of the challenges that are coming and figuring out ways to get some of the transmission, whether like things like the state agreement approach and PJM and how that's all working too.
And I would agree with what Pamela just stated. I think you've seen movement, obviously, in North Carolina. We heard Ken state that there's been movement. Just the issuance of the ANOPR and the NOPR has caused movement within the different regions. And I like hearing that it's a floor. You've heard me, if any of you have watched the task force, and you'll hear this probably later on, you need to respect those regional differences. And as long as that is respected, then the floor rules, I think, are appropriate.
And I think it's also important, it's not going to be a silver bullet. Nothing that comes out that's going to apply to the whole country is going to fix any region's problems holistically, completely, right? That this is why there's no silver bullet here. It's not going to solve everything. It's going to be important, but what's been proposed in the interconnection final rule that should come out today is largely incremental in nature. And some of the areas are really considering more aggressive, comprehensive reform to those, like what CAISO is considering for their interconnection process, what MISO is doing right now is they're considering changes to their interconnection process. So I don't think rulemaking should hold back regions from kind of fulfilling their responsibilities.
And actually, could I follow up with that? So I did pull some numbers for today because, the states are a laboratory for innovation and this interconnection rule is coming out, but North Carolina followed Colorado. And we've already instituted our interconnection reform, so we're not a serial process. We've moved to the cluster study process, and I just want to tell you, the last time I spoke about this, we didn't really have any results, but I wanted to give you the results. So prior to our queue reform, we had 470 projects in the queue that totaled 29,000 megawatts. And then in 2022, that dropped down to around 10,000 megawatts. And now so we're doing an annual study cluster process. And for the 2023 DICES, and don't ask me what that means. It's definitive interconnection something. And so there were only 49 requests with 3,000 megawatts. So we have really cleared the backlog. The caveat to that is we do have a different solar RFP that's going to be opening up later this year. And so there'll be a few more requests and more megawatts in that process as well, but going down from 470 projects to 49, and let's even say that it's 100, is a great improvement in our interconnection queue. And we've removed all of the speculative projects.
So just staying on interconnection here, FERC, just staying on interconnection for a second. FERC, just lose my train of thought for 1 second. Okay, so what are folks looking for in a final interconnection rule? There have been cases where developers they've been asked to fund network upgrades to parts of the transmission system that are hundreds of miles away, often for tens of millions of dollars. I think the consensus industry view is that that's kind of a failure in terms of proactively planning the transmission capacity that will facilitate more interconnection capacity, which is really becoming a finite resource. So just, were there any deficiencies in the proposed rule that you think need to be cured, or ways that the proposed rule could be strengthened in a final version? And maybe Pam could go first, then others could chime in.
So the final rule can only be what's called a logical outgrowth of what was in the underlying rulemaking. So you can't introduce brand new ideas that people didn't have a chance to comment on. So generally, you're not going to see something big new. You can't see something big and new get put into a final rule that wasn't already in a proposed rule. But if questions are teed up, and there always are, that could provide sufficient notice that that's where it's kind of going to go. It feels very strange to speculate as to what's in the rule, as it's getting issued, but I don't expect it to be personally, to do anything really drastically different than what it did. It might even be a little bit softer, potentially. So we'll all see in a few hours if I'm right. But I think the question you're raising, I think that you're hitting on, is like the real, like the equities and efficiencies of this process that we have, where we've had it's a really reactionary way to think about the development of the system, right? And it has to be if you're thinking about like, I'm going to be building upgrades as needed when somebody wants to connect, and that timing of it, rather than building out the system so that it's opened up and resources can kind of come online. And so, there's only so much you can fix within the interconnection process itself if you don't get your planning right. And there's the whole issue of participant funding. It's hard to tackle, and I think that's largely why it hasn't been solved. But I think there are certainly instances where what's being funded really violate like the beneficiary pay principle that it's supposed to. Like if you're paying for an upgrade, that's benefiting a much broader sense. And I think what we're going to see probably are some complaints coming associated with that. To me, it feels like that's what's going to happen, and maybe that helps drive things forward in terms of thinking about that issue of who are the right folks to pay for it. And I think there can be creative thinking, and we'll see what the regions come up with on that. But the benefit of doing really robust planning is that an interconnection customer still is going to have to pay cost to plug in, but it shouldn't be. It's that's that general analogy of like you're the last car to get on the highway to pay for the entire new lane, and everyone else is using it. And so we need to know that like these areas are getting built up. We're going to need another highway lane to get out there, and we shouldn't wait for that car. Then it's going to take a whole lot longer to go there. And in the meantime, no one can get to that destination. And I think that's going to be, it's a well-used analogy, but I think it's quite apt to the challenge. And I think interconnection can only go so far because it's inherently reactionary and can't be actually again skating to where the puck is going to be.
Yeah, just a few other thoughts here. So, I heard or I read something most recently that either we invest in connect, which is what we do today. So if you invest in the transmission system, we connect you, or we connect you and then manage you. We can go ahead and connect you with direct connection, get you onto the system, and then if the system's congested or if we have system issues, you're probably not going to run, right, in a lot of cases. So there, again, is why the transmission planning, going to Pam's point, has to be integrated as part of this process. So just pure physics, if you look at just the physics alone, we're a 200,000 megawatt system. We have 200,000 megawatts of generation. So now we layer 300,000 more megawatts of generation on top of that. And then people wonder why the transmission system can't handle it. Well, it's not designed to handle 500,000, it's designed to handle 200,000. So now the question is, how do we plan the system in a way that creates enough headroom to achieve state goals, which Kim's very interested in? How do we achieve the state renewable portfolio goals that they have? We can go ahead and plan for that. But you quickly get into this cost allocation issue. And I think it's important to understand the history of how we got here. Back in the late 90s, we developed this generation interconnection process when we were connecting 800,000 megawatt combined cycle large gas plants that took years and years to develop, getting air permits, local siting, all those noise issues you get into. So we developed this process in a way back in the 90s to discipline the generation developers to locate in feasible areas and make sure that they then, and we, could facilitate a market, whether it's a capacity, energy, or ancillary market, so that they could participate and make money, right? And that would be then reliable for our load, bring on resource adequacy, and have appropriate operating reserve margins. So we did it that way in terms of a participant funding model to really discipline developers to locate in more feasible areas where we have headroom on the system. Now what we have is that we have a lot of very small type developers. We have a lot of very sophisticated developers who have much smaller solar wind farms distributed all across the entire footprint. And we're now getting ourselves into a situation where we need to take a look at how do we get out ahead of this and build appropriate transmission in order to accommodate some of the needs. At the same time, we see things like extreme weather. John talked about that just a little bit ago. We're seeing extreme weather, which is leading to some resilience type standards that I think that are going to be coming out. We're talking about interregional transmission. We talked about that this morning as well. Talking about offshore wind, which we'll talk about, I think, in just a bit. And we're talking about this changing fleet. So somehow all this has got to get integrated. We got to demonstrate a need to accommodate all this generation, this 300,000 megawatts we have in the queue. And I will tell you, in all honesty, the vast majority of our generation developers we have in our queue today are not there to own and operate the generation. They're there to do what? They're there to develop the project and flip it, right? So, I have developers who are screaming and yelling about how long it takes to get through the queue, but these are the same developers who at the same time tell me they're required to put 10 or 12 projects into the queue, but they're only going to have money enough to build one. So it's a little bit of a fishing expedition, if you will, and looking for the sweet spot in the system to interconnect. So we're trying to provide some additional tools for developers to take a look at, provide some additional guidance. Some people are hiring some very sophisticated consulting firms looking for headroom in the system where they can accommodate it. But today, the way we're looking at this is where's the best place to interconnect generation? At a retired generation facility. So if you have a 1,000 megawatt coal plant going to retire, where's the best place to interconnect solar? Right there. Because why? Because you have the transmission capability on the system. And we're going to have 40,000 megawatts retiring off of our system between today and 2030, minimum, maybe more. So where's the best place to interconnect? It's at those retired fossil units in many, many cases. So that's one thing that we're going to be certainly taking a hard look at, and we're going to be taking a hard look at what transmission capability do we need to try to get out ahead of the energy transition as we flip from fossil fuels to renewables and try to get enough transmission capability on the system with our long-range transmission planning processes.
So I'll just mention North Carolina is not within an RTO, so we don't have the participant funding. We have the crediting program, except for state level. So state level, like PURPA projects under 80 megawatts, they do have the participant funding model. So, some developers try to figure out, let's bump up, be over 80 megawatts, not do PURPA. And then we have the crediting policy. But just how the commission dealt with that in the carbon plan order is, for example, with the red zone. So the red zone projects, those are going to go into the baseline. So even if you were a PURPA project and had participant funding, you're not going to have to pay for those upgrades. Those will just be socialized through the ratepayers. However, in picking, because the whole point of participant funding is to make sure to have it be in the most efficient part of the system, to still have that type of input is when they're looking at the process, there's still going to be that project that's interconnecting, even though they don't have to pay those network upgrades. They're going to be assigned those network upgrades to fill the resource solicitation. So if you have 600 megawatts, you're soliciting for 600 megawatts of solar, they're going to have, and you're getting the lowest cost bids to fill that 600 megawatts, they're going to receive that network upgrade even if they don't have to pay for it.
And so FERC is also considering a potential minimum transfer standard. It gathered public comments on that in May, and it seemed like commenters were largely split over whether the commission should pursue more of a prescriptive approach where some commenters were suggesting kind of a generic standard of 25% of a neighboring region's peak load, and then there were other commenters such as PJM where they were urging the commission to preserve regional flexibility in any sort of potential standard. Just would love to kind of go down the line here and get folks' thoughts on that.
Sure. Anyone that's watched the Joint Task Force, I can sum it up in 5 words, but I'll expand. Like, no mandates, respect regional differences. So that's really the short answer to the question. But there's 2 reasons for that with respect to this issue. The first is cost, and then the second is it really going to do solve the problem that's needed. With respect to the first issue on cost, I mean, even California is saying it's maybe too costly and not really do what it's supposed to do. But as a state regulator, we have 2 open rate cases right now. I've been traveling the state because I've gone to the East Coast, to the West Coast, or the mountains and we have to do public witness hearings. And so that's something that people within DC probably don't have experience doing unless they came up like Christy from state regulators. Costs really matter. I mean, everyone in this room can afford a $20 increase, but we go around the state and there are, with the low and moderate income customers, they cannot afford even $1 more. And we hear, I can think of one woman who testified in the last rate case. She had $16, so she came from Kroger or Food Line, and she said, listen, I have $16 to feed my husband and myself for the next 2 weeks, and I'm walking around Food Line or Kroger to figure out what can I buy to feed the 2 of us for 2 weeks. And I went home and told my son that story, and he said, Mom, I spend $16 on lunch sometimes. And so cost is really front of mind. We're going to build a lot of transmission. A lot of transmission is going to be built, but we have to be surgical, we have to be targeted, and we have to make the transmission build really count, every single dollar. And so I'll also give one more example about does it really solve the problem? And I'll mention Winter Storm Elliott. And Ken can correct me if I'm wrong, but right before the rolling outages in North Carolina, there was plenty of interregional transfer capability between PJM and North Carolina. I know y'all may have read some report that said differently, but that report is incorrect. And I asked Duke when we brought him in January to explain what happened. The capacity was there. It was the electrons. The electrons couldn't get there. So it was a resource adequacy issue, not a transmission issue, to pull that in from PJM. So that's how I feel about transfer capabilities.
I think it's really helpful to think through examples of when it works, when we've really relied upon it, in areas where it's not going to solve all of your problems. So the idea that if you build enough transfer capability between regions, like we can all be done with all of these, like bring on the bad weather, we're ready for it, I think is probably wrong. Because again, there's not power to wheel through. It's not there, then it's not going to solve it. But we've also seen how valuable it can really be, and not just avoiding. In Winter Storm Uri, we see how helpful interregional transfer capacity was to bring that over. It certainly avoided blackouts then. I think the reliability and the health and human life risks that we see that can come from these storms, it's really, obviously, we all take this quite seriously. But there's also a cost impact to it. When you have it working well, it can really avoid scarcity pricing and scarcity conditions by providing access to resources that are not facing the same threat. So I think there is very well supported value to having transfer capability between regions. I don't think that it is a solution to everything. As to a minimum number, a blanket number that applies to the whole country, that seems hard to justify, although a lot easier to implement if Congress gave us a number and said, it's 20% and go do it. I think in some ways that would be a little bit easier, but it probably wouldn't be as much like the right way of doing that. I think really understanding the region's risk profiles, understanding where it can be helpful, thinking about which types of scenarios and what maybe used to be tail risk events we think that we want to kind of protect against, and how much could really provide cost savings. But anytime you're talking about this, and I think it's not just the commission, it's not just the FERC commissioners that were state commissioners. I think at FERC, I know they all keep the cost top of mind as well. So I think understanding like who's going to pay for it and where you're going to put it. But generally, it's a really good thing to have. It's hard for me to think about how you justify a blanket number that works for all of the regions in the country. But there may be some ways regions can develop that with some guardrails from FERC as to how to think about it, so that there's still like some kind of meaningful amount that would need to be built, but maybe not 25% everywhere.
Yeah, I guess I agree as well with Pam. Couple thoughts, right? So we too do not agree with just a flat percentage because every region's a little different. Pam mentioned risk, which we agree with. It depends on where you have generation. We can have all the interregional transfer capability that one could ever dream of, but if you can't get it to the borders and transfer it, or if there's congestion inside the other system, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So at the end of the day, what we recommended to FERC was a study of some sort that we could perform with our neighbors, that we could pull off and take a look at how much we have in terms of renewables. If we're only sitting at 10% renewables right now, and maybe MISO's at 15%, I don't know that I need 25% transfer capability of load, meaning if their load's 100,000 megawatts, I got to transfer 25,000 megawatts to them. I think the answer is it depends. We've made a bunch of comments around let's take a look at the studies, and I think it's going to be a moving target. We're going to be increasing this as the penetration levels of renewables continue to climb in each one of our systems. That transfer capability is going to have to go up, and the cold hard fact is we're going to have to be leaning on each other more so during some of these extreme events like today and tomorrow, like Winter Storm Uri or Winter Storm Elliott and other storms of the future. And we run a lot of scenario studies today. We do a study under NERC standards today called TPL 1-4 where we look at extreme events across your system. We study that every single year. We file it with RFC and NERC, but we don't reinforce for those. The one thing we have done in our region, though, that I think has been very successful is we have, for the most part, reinforced around a lot of the SIP 14 facilities. So if you think about SIP 14 is a standard that came out of NERC that said you got to physically protect critical substations that have large loss of load if you would lose them or the system could go unstable, on and on. We've reinforced around the bulk of those substations within our system in addition to physically protecting those stations. So that's one level of resilience that we've done. But there's also some things I think that's got to be included when we talk about interregional transfer and why. What's the driver for it? It's probably extreme events. It's likely the fact that we have higher concentrations of renewables across our systems. And that's going to be a moving target for the rest of our careers and lives, frankly, that we're going to have to take a close look at as it moves forward.
I think we probably have time for one more question before we open it up to the audience here. Ken, PJM's been doing some really interesting, innovative things on offshore wind planning under its state agreement approach. Just wondering if there are any lessons there that other states could draw on and apply to their own transmission.
Yeah, for sure, Zack.
Areas.
Yeah, couple lessons learned there. I think communication's key. Communication's absolutely key with the state commission who wants to sponsor that level of renewables or state policy, whatever it may be. In this case with New Jersey, we have a provision in our tariff called the state agreement approach that allows them as a state to create whatever policy they want to, and that we would then go ahead and accommodate their needs through regional transmission expansion planning. And we did that. And we come up with $1.1 billion worth of transmission to accommodate 7,500 megawatts of offshore wind. Really successful. We're looking forward to that getting built. From a system operator viewpoint, it's fantastic because we're going to have generation to the east. Instead of whales and dolphins, we're going to also have generation coming in. We're going to be able to bolster the system at some point in the future. We'll likely tie New Jersey as well as the rest of our 5 coastal states in with New York, New England, and our southern areas. So it really creates another level of resilience. It creates another level of a more robust and reliable transmission grid. So it's outstanding for us. So we're really looking forward to that. But communication's key. I think the other thing, and John mentioned this earlier as well, you got to get the transmission built and get out ahead of it. I spent some time in Germany and talking to some of those folks, and they got behind. and they had generation sitting offshore that couldn't run because they didn't have the transmission capability. So we've been trying to get out ahead of that. We've done a pretty good job getting out ahead of it. And then the final thing is, we had to do a lot of education around this, just because, you have generation offshore that, you and your state are paying for. It's far more economical. And right now we have 5 coastal states talking about 25,000 megawatts of offshore wind. Far more economical for us to do a regional plan and build regional transmission to accommodate all 25,000 versus us accommodating just New Jersey and building out the transmission system just to accommodate New Jersey, with what was 7,500 megawatts now moving to 11,000 megawatts. And if you look at the whole system, it's going to be a lot less expensive to combine everybody's offshore wind efforts together. And then we can allocate the cost based on whatever we need to do there. So I think it's very exciting.
And any additional thoughts from either of you two? So I think, we're ready to open it up to audience questions now.
I'll go ahead and start. So I think sometimes when I look at some of these issues, and there's so many of them swirling around on transmission, you try to figure out how does this all fit together, right? And it reminds me a little bit of the Dr. Dolittle story, where there's this creature called a push me pull you, which looks like a llama with 2 heads in opposite directions that can go either back and forth and never get anywhere, right? So if you look at that, I'm curious as to whether we may have some potential regulatory push-me-pull-you situations going on right now, and how do we reconcile that? And particularly, you talked, Zack, about the tremendous needs that are projected on transmission development over the next 20 or 30 years, and whether you're talking about doubling or tripling the size of the grid, the task is monumental and enormous, and is going to cost a fair amount of money. On the other hand, we're seeing an awful lot of focus on cost containment issues and cost concerns. And I'm just looking at whether we may have a potential dynamic there where one is working against the other, and perhaps we're not going to achieve either goal depending on how they work out. I guess I'm curious from all of your perspectives, how do we balance those two in particular as we move forward in trying to meet some of these goals that we've got established?
It's a great point, Larry. So look, I think I'm kind of in the same boat as what Kim is earlier. We talked about relative to being surgical with our transmission, right? So again, our system is a little different than a lot of other areas. We're not like the western part of the system, or maybe even the Midwest or Texas. Very tightly integrated system. But I think we're going to have to be surgical so that we can be cost conscious out there. And at the same point, we recognize we got to get out ahead of this and build the appropriate transmission to accommodate some of these different policy goals that we have, whether they're at a state level or a federal level. So it's a very fine line. There isn't one stakeholder meeting that meets with our board that goes by where we have one party saying transmission costs are going through the roof. You all as the board need to do something about it. And that we have another group saying, you're not building near enough transmission. Please start building more transmission. We have all these different goals in mind. We need a lot more transmission across the grid. Every single board meeting.
I think it's hard to hear for a lot of folks that we're just not building enough transmission when they see their bills and they see the cost going up for it. I think that's just, it's a hard narrative. And I think putting a regulator hat on, if you're going to say, we want to authorize you to build much, much, much more, then it's going to be more important, it's always important, but even more important to make sure that you're not spending money where you shouldn't. And that's not necessarily like unneeded projects, but maybe they're not the right size of the projects, what maybe there needs to be. That's where the idea of oversight initially at the commission was seen, not necessarily in tension, but I think in balance. That if we're going to have an aggressive look towards building transmission to meet our future needs, we need to make sure that we're doing that in a cost-effective way. And I think taking some of the inefficiencies out of the system inherently makes that, if you can start to do things at scale, that should reduce costs. I think some of the concern about transmission spend is a lack of information or understanding of why some of that money was spent, and I think there's always particularly for this group, I think there's always a really good opportunity to kind of help regulators understand about how much goes into trying to not just keep costs down, but really think strategically about, is this the right project and why there's not a better project for this. But I'm not familiar with your reference to Dr. Doolittle, the two-headed, I don't know what that is, although it gave me some homework to look up. But I don't think as an industry that we can have this be. I think if we take it on as something intention, I think if we take it on as something intention, I think we're all going to lose. Because if we're fighting over building anything, because we have to figure out a way to do this with, I think at least is how I believe FERC started that kind of those efforts on the different tracks, was to do it in balance. That there might be some need, and I don't know that, I know folks are really concerned about independent transmission monitors, or some commissioners are opposed to some formula rates, and there's a lot of scary things that are being floated around for some, depending upon where you sit. But ultimately, we need confidence that the transmission being built is necessary, and I think that's having open communication and transparency as to how that's going. But I don't think they need to be in tension or in conflict. I think they can really be quite complementary.
And I would agree with that. It's really all about balance. I mean, as a regulator, that's what we do every day, is try to balance all of the issues that seem to compete with each other. And the one other comment that I'll make that I'm not sure I've heard yet is with respect to, or I heard reference to, right-sizing it. And we've already dealt with that in the carbon plan as well. Our public staff, which represents the using and consuming public, they have really said it all comes down to transmission planning. We don't want to upgrade the upgrade, right? And so right-sizing those projects is appropriate in the transmission planning space.
James Amato with Burns McDonnell. Great panel. No matter how proficient and surgical we're going to be, costs are going up. Bills are going to go up. And the poor person referenced in the story that's got $16, that's not one person, that's going to be a lot of people. And that being the question, from regulatory perspective, I'm wondering, how do you mitigate the issue of who can afford to pay versus who can't? And are there structural models outside of doing everything you can regarding addressing reliability and resiliency and exponential growth and making sure everything is transparent and fine, but still the downstream realities are still true? What can a regulator do? And what models would you think of implementing to deal with the cost of people who can pay and people who will not be able to pay?
So I'll start. That's something that keeps me up at night, as well as cybersecurity issues, because we don't know how. We all agree costs are going to go up. We're in this transition. We're in a build cycle right now, and how do we deal with LMI customers? And I'm not sure there's an answer to that right now, and that keeps me up at night.
I think, there are cost benefits to building some of these transmission. You have access to lower cost generation, and I think, and it's not going to help someone who can't pay their electric bill, but I think if you think about what the cost is of not doing it and what that looks like, how much our society depends upon reliable power, what it looks like when we can't keep the lights on through storms, and what that does. So I think that I don't envy the state regulators who have to deal with this on a day in and day out basis, but I think it's going to be expensive. It's why we have to make sure it's not more expensive than it should be, and that we're thinking long-term and strategically about how to build out our grid, and that we're really understanding the value proposition of what that looks like. And it's not just, here's the cost, well, this is going to be expensive, but what are you going to get for it? And if we don't do that, what do those costs look like? So I think what the cost of not building this is quite significant.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. You bring up some really I think, difficult, real socioeconomic type issues that society has, not only here but across the world, right? So, and I'm kind of in the same boat, I guess, as Pam, is that, look, the cost of not having it, can be much more severe than maybe the cost being a little bit higher than what it is today. So that's kind of the way I'm trying to reconcile this in my head.
Good afternoon at this point. Julia Freyer with London Economics. Following on that discussion, a little bit still on the kind of the rate aspect, the rate design aspect that follows the planning, or I actually think it has to collaborate with the planning, because you can't plan a project that you'll never get approved and financed and built in the first place. One of the things that I've been kind of struggling with is, especially in this context of a transforming system that has a lot more intermittent resources, which makes it a lot more susceptible to weather-driven patterns of supply and even demand. When it's extremely hot, we have much higher load. When it's extremely cold, in some places, we also have much higher load, and will likely have even higher load in the future with electrification. What I'm worried about is going back to kind of the business cases for planning, and this idea of well, what if we don't build? The underlying context for regulation for more than 100 years has been the used and useful standard, which is we build stuff that we're going to use. But what happens if we need to build stuff that we will only use in emergencies? It puts the used and useful concept really on its head, I think. And I guess because I've been scratching my head, I don't know if you guys have some ideas on how to reconcile that. Transmission usually gets easier to build, easier to justify if we can use it baseload all the time, or a lot of times we're going to be flowing and utilizing. What happens if we have to build transmission as a backstop, really, as we won't need it, but if we do need it, it's going to, save lives, save billions of dollars of higher cost. How do we factor that into a rate-making formula that we've been used to?
So I think you could analogize it to peaker plants. Peaker plants may just run one time a year or 2 times a year, but they're part of the stack, the generation stack, and so they're used and useful. And I would kind of analogize it to that used and useful analysis.
And I've struggled a little bit with the premise. I'm trying to think through what type of transmission facility would be. I can see how the value of it might be akin to a peaker, where you see the real value, not happen during some of these extreme events. But I still think it's going to be utilized a lot more than even a peaking unit. That would be. I would still think that power would be flowing on it, so you'd still kind of meet that used and useful. But I think when you start to, when the planners are starting to figure out where, what size, I think those things change around a better understanding of the risk in which you're trying to solve for, and where, if it wasn't for making sure that you have enough to get through certain, maybe it would be smaller, but it's still hard for me to see what kind of transmission facilities would not have power flowing on them, but for a couple of times a year when there's some extreme event. So I think the terms of the used and useful standard, I would think that would be met.
Yeah, and I'm not a rate maker by any stretch, but certainly, you raise a lot of things in there, and there's a lot to unpack in your question. But look, to your point, we can study anything. The question is, can you build it? And then is there somebody to pay for it, right? So we run scenario studies, we run Monte Carlo analyses with 10,000 different simulations, and then the question is, can we build it? Can we get the state commission to approve it? And then is somebody willing to pay for it without fighting it out in the courts for years and years, right? But you raise a point that's interesting. If you look at how we design the transmission grid, we designed the transmission grid to a point under certain standards that have certain headroom. So we may go to a transmission owner and say, hey, we have a violation of NERC criteria or our criteria that requires an increase of capacity of 1,000 megawatts to go from point A to point B into this load. So they may come back, and I may go to Dave Weaver at Exelon, and he may come back to me and say, hey, our standard's 1,500 megawatts for this type of 230 kV line. We're going to go ahead and build it at 1,500. So we don't build things to the margin of what we need to solve the problem today or even 5 years from now, because we're planning this system a day out, 2 days out, 3 days out, and the bulk of our upgrades come 5 years out. Some 8 years, but not as many, right? We'll see how that goes into the future. But we've designed the system in such a way historically, and I think we will futuristically, in such a way to provide that headroom. Now, the scenario that you're raising where you could leave, where we could come up with a major need, where we need a major 765 line tapping in from West Virginia into Virginia Beach. We could come up with something like that because we need to accommodate offshore wind off the coast of Virginia, right? Sorry, Zack, I didn't mean to get my hand over there. So we could come up with something like that, and we could say, hey, we need to build it, and it's going to take 8 years to site it and 2 years to build it. So here we are, we fast forward 2033, right? There's some new technology that comes out, and we can site little small nuclear modular type reactors throughout the footprint of very strategic sites. To your point, that advanced technology, things we don't quite know yet today when it will go commercial, could deem that asset useless, frankly, except for under extreme conditions. So that's the only scenario that I could envision, some sort of new technology that could come along in our futures that could deem the transmission system useless, right, to some level. The other thing, if there's some new technology, we all can spend $5,000 and put it each home, and we can have electricity basically for free, basically after the install. Maybe something like that where you won't need a transmission. I've heard people say that before, that in 10 years we're not even going to need a transmission system because there's going to be a new technology out there that we'll have at each one of our homes that will supply the electricity for all of us. And I've heard one of our CEOs within our footprint said of the 200 things that he worries about, that's probably number 198 on his list of things to worry about.
My concern going back to this idea of what if we don't build is, well, we adopt the technology risk and then we defer building, but then that new technology doesn't develop.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And we don't have electricity to fuel people's cars, heat people's or cool people's homes,
Right.
or to turn on the lights, or to do our work, because all of us have laptops. And
That's right.
up with it.
That's right. Exactly.
If I could add as well, in most states you have a certificate process, CPCN process, so that's kind of like a warm blanket for whoever's building the asset. And so the need is determined at that time. So if they have a CPCN, they'd be hard pressed to have it be found not used and useful. So that kind of is dealt with up front. And then, but what Kim was talking about is you could potentially have abandoned plant. But historically, a developer would receive that abandoned plant cost because it's at the time the need when it was developed and built is where you go back to.
I have to laugh at that warm blanket with the CPCN process. I've never heard that analogy, but I'm going to start trying to use that a little more.
Well, Ken, as a Star Trek fan on your new technology thing, I'm banking on the development of dilithium crystals as the solution to all this.
Dr. Spock.
But thank you very much, panel. In keeping with the Wires program tradition of always leave them wanting more, we could keep going on for a while on this one, but we're going to call it a close because we do have our lunch available. I want to thank the panelists. Commissioner Duffley, thank you for arranging for this fantastic weather for us here in your home state. Pamela, Ken, Zack, thank you very much for your panel. I want to thank everybody for being here. Look forward to our fall meeting, November 1st and 2nd in Washington at the Watergate Hotel, so there'll be some information coming out on that. And with that, we're going to call this one a wrap. Everyone, lunch is where we had breakfast and the cocktail reception and dinner yesterday, so join us over there for our concluding lunch. Thank you very much.
Thanks.